Hello, this is Jim Schaefer. I'm the executive producer and host of Rip Rap, the academic book television program. I have a special program today on new books that we've gotten, and I'm talking about them with my colleague, Randy Baier.
It's great to be back again. This is the third time we've done this review of your new acquisitions.
And we've got quite a selection here, Randy, right? We've got a little music, a little radio.
Right, music, film, some cinema, some books on law, culture.
Performance art.
I saw one on the life of props in the theater.
That's right.
Looks like a great
You've got
batch.
one in your hand there.
This one is called Sound of Africa, Making Music Zulu in a South African Studio by a well-respected ethnomusicologist, Louise Menchis, who actually kind of made a splash in the academic scene by writing about Graceland, the album put together by Paul Simon. This is about creating a Zulu identity in the studio. She looks very closely at a studio performance situation and how musicians get together and really create Zulu-ness, so to speak, and the process of doing it in the studio environment. So if for an ethnomusicologist, anthropologist type of scholar, one really likes to see sort of the day-by-day, hour-by-hour process of creation. And so it's a close ethnography of that.
And I've got a book here that we also got, Disenchanting Le Bon Temps, and this is by Charles Stavali, who teaches at Wayne State. Identity and Authenticity in Cajun Music and Dance. I just let the good times roll.
Right,
and
right.
so it's a similar thing. It's a study of southern Louisiana and the Cajun culture. And so that's kind of fun.
Yeah, I want to see where he takes that. And you know, interestingly enough, South African music and a lot of African music looks to Cajun music. There's a lot of influence from the New Orleans, Louisiana.
Oh, really?
Region. So
I liked, we try to explore music and different cultural aspects, and we've got a little technology here. I think that you were interested in Communities of the Air.
Communities of the Air, Radio Century, Radio Culture. This is an edited volume, edited by Susan Merrill Squire. Again, you know, it's Duke is putting out lots of interesting materials on culture and performance and the arts, media especially. This has three or four interesting breakdowns. Radio technology across the 20th century, kind of a historical perspective. Radio cultures themselves, various aspects of radio. One article in here I'm interested in is by Kathy Newman called The Forgotten 15 Million, Black Radio Radicalism and the Construction of the Negro Market. And of course, black radio stations are kind of, well, they're not so unsung anymore, but for a long time they were unsung in terms of that whole generation of sort of black and white mixing, history of rock and roll, and certainly rhythm and blues and American music of the last 50 years. And finally, radio ideologies about aspects of radio. And within this, something that we're both interested, I know, is the building of community through radio, especially low-power radio, new sort of ideologies of new aspects of technology and how radio can sort of get local.
Next, we've got another radio one here. Radio Goes to War.
Ah, good one. You know, I was talking to my mom on the way into the interview here. She told me about several radio announcers that she used to listen to. I was asking her if commentary was sort of parallel and the same, but she was remembering some commentators, and I was sort of making parallels. Well, was this the Rush Limbaugh of the of the 40s? This particular person, Elmer Davis, who wasn't a Rush Limbaugh of the 40s, but there was also a religious commentator, Father Kaufman, who was listened to nationally. This in particular is about some slightly different. Well, I think Elmer Davis was a commentator on sort of democracy and the war years. Cultural Politics of Propaganda During World War II, and by Gerd Horton, Radio Goes to War, certainly about how the message was spread effectively disseminated to the American public, and also probably to the certainly to the soldiers as well, letting people know how the progress of the war was going, and also how, in a sense,
all that stuff. They learned about the war with Frank, FDR being on the radio talking about the Pearl Harbor had been invaded.
Exactly. And then, of course, the news reports by Edward R. Morrow and Charles Collingwood, Walter Winchell, Eric Sevareid.
And then the speeches by Winston Churchill, and you had mentioned earlier the stage life of props. And this is Andrew Sofer, and this is a guy at Boston College, and this is really a lot of fun. I got this because it's just so much fun, and it's, we think about stage props, but there's more to them, and he calls them time machines of the theater. And you have the bloody handkerchief on the Elizabethan stage and all this stuff. So
significant messages coming from one object.
And they encapsulate sort of a symbolism of what's going on with that. So I thought that was just, and then all these things that people take as for granted, but it's also a stylized, highly symbolic, iconic kind of element.
Well, certainly you think of the floating knife in Macbeth.
Right.
Or,
and the skull.
Yorick's skull in Hamlet.
Certainly
just put in a plug for Arsenic and Old Lace. I mean, the whole thing is prop laden. So.
Well, and then there's this book. I got it. It's Robert Burt, and he's, where is he? He's at Yale. Actually, he's a professor of law at Yale. And Death is That Man Taking Names, Intersections of American Medicine, Law, and Culture. And we were talking before we went on with this interview, boy, if there's anything that is just chilling, it's this idea that death is a highly personal issue. It's not something you can send in. You can't mail it in. It's you.
Right.
And he's looking at the definition of death, which is actually quite, because it's medicine and law and culture, is becoming quite an issue now with technology. Is at what point is someone actually dead? I think the definition now is that it has to involve no activity in the brainstem.
Some kind of an aspect of right. And in fact, because now they can sense activity at a much lower level than maybe.
So I mean, at what point is someone? Do you keep someone alive? And they always say, well, they're just going to be a vegetable, but there's been just recently people coming out of comas that had been really. And this one, I'm going to let you talk a little bit about the other Los Angeleses.
Oh, wonderful cover on this. In other Los Angeleses, multicentric, great title, performance art, multicentric performance art by Mei-Ling Cheng. Great cover. I know you're going to cut this in later, but just put a little display there. Another, Mei-Ling Cheng is a director of critical studies at the School of Theater at Southern California. And this is a broad survey of performance art right in Los Angeles. I like these because they really look closely at a community, and as does Louise Menchie's book. And in fact, I think there's a departure in scholarship now that these books show, that instead of kind of broad applications of theory, we now say, okay, let's go down to the neighborhood level and see what people are really doing in terms of performance and community contact. And theater is
such
social
a richness
engagement.
in this book, and the writing is just really marvelous. She talks about, all the different things that are going on. And it's challenging a lot of the presumptions we have about the way we see and listen and perceive. And there's all kinds of ways. There's one story in there about this guy, he just takes baby powder. He's I think Indian.
Okay.
And he puts baby powder on him, and then he gives this insane clownish kind of smile. And he's doing all kinds of things about ethnicity and perception and visual, outer appearance.
That's where theater can really say things in ways that writing or something more literal just cannot tell you. They can't.
Well, it's come a long way from even not long ago with Laurie Anderson and the performance art. It's becoming very complex and richly textured. And then talking about, this is one that we've been talking about back and forth since we started talking about this interview about mobile cultures, new media, and queer Asia. This book just blew my mind. I mean, it just doesn't seem to fit. what you think of as
Right.
Asian culture.
Now, mobile is talking about pretty much the cell phone, the instantaneous communication through cell phone technology. I mean, that's a major trope in
Right.
this book.
Well, I think it's also the mobility. People associate Asian culture with being staid and kind of ongoing and permanent and not changing. And what they're showing here is that the cultures in contemporary culture is really fluid, and that they're absorbing. I was reading things about in Japan now they've got a human washing machine, and they showed this picture in the New York Times of this elderly woman with her head popping out of this thing, and she was liking the bubbles. That was doing this thing, and they talked about they have pants now, kind of like a suit or a transporter.
Yeah.
Where they can have someone, that has mobility issue, they can actually sit in this thing and it moves them around just as though they were walking.
Fantastic.
And so it's that kind of thing, only the juxtaposition of mobility, of fluidity in Asia, and then queer culture on top of it, not that queer culture is so unusual, but it's unusual in how you conceptualize it.
Well, there's a discussion in here about how alternative sexualities are involved with a technology. So in a sense, the ability to sort of communicate, build a community from underneath, I guess, the sort of the mainstream, that the technology gives you that ability. It's a very fascinating book. Mobile Cultures, New Media in Queer Asia.
Well, in this book, one of the hot issues as we're sitting here is same-sex marriages. They're cropping up. It started off in Massachusetts with a ruling by the Supreme Court there, and now there's California and New York. This book actually predates that somewhat, but it's Inside the American Couple, New Thinking, New Challenges, by Marion Yalom and Laura Christensen, and they're both at the Institute for Research on Women and Gender at Stanford. But they're taking a look at what is the American couple, and it's much different than what you think. And they're not making that distinction between heterosexual, homosexual, or same-sex or whatever. They're just trying to see how it functions.
In a sense.
Right.
Yeah.
And that they point out that everybody in America at one point or another has to have a long-term relationship. 90% or more of the people enter into some kind of long-term relationship. And I think that's one of the central concepts now with the argument by the homosexual community is that they're saying, well, we have relationships just like anybody else, and we want to celebrate that, and it's been unrecognized, and so we want to have that legally recognized.
Right.
And then President Bush has come out with his support for a constitutional amendment saying that it only can be a man and a woman. So there's a real cultural polarization that's happening.
You're right on the edge there.
And I just thought that was fascinating in terms of that particular debate.
Timely, tapping the pulse of the nation, so to speak.
Right. Yeah, you were looking at this one too, the suburban space, the fabric of dwelling.
I love books like this. And it's also a wonderful, wonderful cover. Suburban Space, The Fabric of Dwelling by Renee Y. Cho, who is associate professor at Berkeley of architecture, and also a principal partner of an urban design studio called Urbis.
Urbis.
But there's going through this book, it's talking about I guess the texture of not only planning design but also just the very shapes of houses, how suburban life in this. Well, a lot of focus on the South
Not only
Charleston,
looking at houses and buildings as objects, but as a part of our existence and the way they interrelate space.
Which is why the fabric is in the title.
Right, the fabric motif.
And in fact, it's a fabric-like cover in that the balustrade in this outside jalousie. I'm murdered.
Go for
French,
it, man.
Right. I'm lost for the English word, but at any rate, it really is a fabric. I mean, it's a textural.
So I liked it because it stands a lot of our ideas of architecture, and it changes it around and makes it look as a vital part of our ecosystem of living, and where we live and how we live.
And looking at suburbia, which has to be looked at. It's a serious phenomenon. As much as we want to run from suburbia, it is
What
now.
was the name of that first, the first subdivision?
The Levittown in Pennsylvania, the design community.
Hopefully we've come a long way since then.
A lot of really nice analysis in this book.
And then we've got, going back to Asia, screening China. I thought this was a lot of fun too, because there's a lot of cinema activity going on in China.
A wide review of modern Chinese film, both historically and
serious cinema. We're not talking the Hong Kong, Jackie Chan
no.
kinds of stuff. We're
serious art cinema from
And there's some lovely
China
films that have been coming out with that that don't require $130 million ships at sea kind of thing.
I like the inclusion of the transnational imaginary in this. I mean, the fact that there are multi-Chinas around the world.
To change the topic a little bit, we got this, I happen to like Louise White a lot, and she has this interest in vampires, and this book is Speaking with Vampires, Rumor in History in Colonial Africa, and it's just a really interesting kind of thing. One of the people who take a look at it called it brilliant, eccentric, and original. And it's all of that, but she takes a look at the role of the vampire, in the Belgian Congo, Northern Rhodesia, Zambian historiography. And one of the things she always makes is the point about, excuse me, how the Africans looked at the Christian ceremony of the Eucharist. And they couldn't get over that, we call it blood, and it's really real, but it isn't real. So, I mean, some of the Africans never could quite get over that. You mean you're eating the body of Christ? So, but she takes that and then trying to understand it, how the Africans dealt with that.
Right,
and the
there's a symbolism that Christianity, European Christianity, whatever, the historical application of Christianity assumes the symbolism is so sort of understood. If you put it in another context and see it with a whole different light, it looks, from another point of view, to be superstition.
Well, and I think also it has to do with discourse. In other words, much of African stuff, there's a different discourse. It's descriptive. It's a part of the mythology forming. And so one of the chapters is bandages on your mouth. See, and they're talking about medicine. But to them, the idea of putting bandages on your mouth, how are you going to explain that?
Right,
and
right.
Vaccines.
No, discourse is a great way to look at it. Well, another fabulous cover. After the Imperial Turn, Thinking with and Through the Nation. Antoinette Burton, editor. A picture of Queen Elizabeth with an islander from the South Pacific, perhaps New Guinea, or possibly someone from Aboriginal person from Australia. A little bit unclear, and of course the not sure what the photograph is from in reality gives you the understanding of what the nation is. It's a great picture.
Well, the juxtaposition, and when they
juxtaposition, yes,
yeah,
good
when they
term.
go on
Thank
these tours of the royalty in the colonies.
Yeah, the previous colonies.
Well, and it's no different with the Pope. When the Pope visits, you see the pageantry of the papacy and all that stuff, and then you got someone in indigenous dress right there, or it's just quite an interesting
both worlds standing next to each other. Well, this literally looks at the concept of nation and global, the sort of, what does nation mean now that we're globalized? I guess that's the best way to put it. And, for instance, Unthinking French History, Colonial Studies Beyond National Identity, and titles such as that. So there are great ranges of, it's not just about the empire, so to speak.
Although it sort of is.
Well, we're really going through a whirlwind here. We're getting right through them here.
The next one I've got is Bill Brown, who's at the University of Chicago English Department, A Sense of Things, the Object Matter of American Literature, and you've got even endorsement by Mick Tauzik at Columbia. And it's just a lot of fun. It's looking at the objects and how they're represented in literature. It says America's love affair with things.
It has a parallel with the book The Life of Props in the theater. There.
Yeah, it's looking at these specific things. The nature of things and creatures of habit, possession, the miracle of history, regional artifacts. So yeah, it gets into a lot of that stuff. Natural history, life groups, and the cultural thing. Isn't that fun?
It looks at it through the view of particular authors?
Modernity and modernism. No, it's its own book. The decoration of houses, so that gets into the architecture, decor, utopia.
Doorknobs.
Yeah. So
interesting.
I just thought this is very inventive and just a lot of fun. A sense of things. And when you ask people who they are and what they're doing, they often start talking about their car or their home or their swimming pool or different objects that they own.
Well, yeah, a car is an obvious icon, isn't it? But what about clocks? People have clocks that go back and really represent clocks in their houses. I mean, they
well,
represent
there's a whole
the
thing
people in the past
with Empire
lives.
about collecting things. The whole thing of collecting, and that was those old stories about anthropology. They went to Africa and brought back
the objects.
They even sometimes brought back people to show them off at the different world fairs and museums and putting things behind glass so you could observe
Sarah
them.
Bartman, that's a famous case.
Talking of empires, we have the emperors in the jungle.
Oh, okay. We're evoking Rousseau in this. John Lindsay Poland, very Rousseauian illustration. Emperors in the Jungle, the hidden history of the U.S. in Panama, and there is a person underneath, but it looks like it may be a soldier as part of the
all you
forest,
see is the eyes.
Right, and it's unclear whether this is meant to be a native person, but I think given the shape of well, it looks like a helmet. A little bit like a helmet, so it's difficult to tell.
But it's someone who's obscured by the jungle.
Obscured by the jungle, right.
Yeah.
So it's hard to see. It's interesting, very interesting illustration. An expose of key episodes in the military involvement of the United States in Panama, written by the director of the Fellowship of Reconciliation Task Force on Latin America and the Caribbean. He's also written Inside Panama, The Essential Guide to Its Politics, Economy, Society, and Environment.
It fascinated me the idea that you'd have the social political structures in the jungle. You think of jungle as being totally wild, and what fascinated me is just looking at how things are set up, and there are even power structures, in this wild thing that we can't quite imagine that it would be. There's another one here, and I found this fascinating, the jurisprudence of emergency, colonialism, and the rule of law. And again, as we're sitting here, this country's still, I would say, at war in Iraq and Afghanistan and any number of places. We've got so many troops around the world that we're having to strain the resources of our reserves and National Guard.
Yeah.
And he's talking about how nation states use this notion of emergency to justify all kinds of colonizing activities.
Certainly in the home country, the concept of emergency gives, certainly in the past 2 years, has allowed
all the rules
are the Patriot Act and these various
right.
other aspects of
There's
homeland
a threat
security.
to the state. Now we can talk
Right.
about putting a whole bunch of people in Guantanamo, and we can enact the Patriot Act, and we can arrest people and hold them in detention. The kicker on this is the author is Nasser Hussein, and he's an Amherst, obviously someone of Middle Eastern background.
Egyptian, perhaps?
And
Iraqi?
so it kind of comes back around, which I found kind of interesting, to have someone who comes from these days there's so much racial profiling going on of anyone from an Arab background. Talking about the jurisprudence, and he's a lawyer, talking about emergency. And it's fascinating that in emergency, the state feels it can justify all kinds of things. It's no different than if, what they call that when they take property, They have a right to it.
Yeah, the right, sure. I
Right,
mean, the,
eminent domain.
right.
They have a right to take
the
it.
common thing, if you're arrested in
Yeah.
a drug bust, for instance, you
Right.
lose your BMW. And,
Yeah.
and
So
all,
it's that whole concept. When
your
there's an
shoes.
emergency, we just need to define emergency,
right.
and we're off to the races.
I wonder if he takes anything from Edward Said, if he picks up on some of the work that.
I don't know.
Edward
I think
Said
he
had been
does,
working
though.
from.
So, got well, this one, the rights of inclusion, about disability. I thought that was kind of interesting. There was becoming more and more an awareness of the fact that people who have certain, physical challenges
Mhm.
really do need to be taken into account, even though as the full price of that is becoming known, now there's more laws trying to limit the impact of that.
Right.
But there's significant improvements being made as far as access.
Well, now it's beyond the shakedown cruise in American politics and democratic life. I mean, truly, if you're going to have an American Disabilities Act, which actually follows through on what it says it will do, or you're going to have no discrimination based on, sex, national origin, race, or gender or sexual persuasion. The follow-through on that really does involve a commitment to making some significant changes.
So that's where we're talking about these books as recent acquisitions and what we're trying to work on as the only program in the United States that focuses just on academic books. So thank you, Randall. We did another kind of compendium,
the
third time.
Right,
Yeah.
the third edition of our yearly
That's
get-together.
right. Yeah.
It's always a joy because it's sort of like having, it's sort of the video equivalent to Briefly Noted or Recently Acquired or something like that. The books that you can't really do a full book review of, but that have come into the library.
Well, our interest is in serious scholarship and the stuff that isn't that's on the cutting edge of what's going on.
Right.
So thank you.
You're welcome. And I hope next time we can have you over to the library at Eastern Michigan University. Maybe we can do one live in the environment.
Yeah.
Right in the library there. Suitable place.
Okay.
So thank you for inviting me.
Thank you for
See
coming.
you next time.
All right.